Today's lesson is all about protists and fungi. Now, these are the next two kingdoms from the 6 kingdoms that we talked about last week. Remember that there were 2 kingdoms of bacteria, eubacteria and archaebacteria. Now we have 2 other kingdoms with simple organisms, living things in them, protists and fungi. Because we're combining 2 sections into one, there are a number of objectives that go along with this lesson. I'd like you, as you listen and learn today, to look for the ability to do these things. Describe the characteristics of protists, describe 4 ways that protists get their food, describe 3 ways that protists reproduce, describe the characteristics of fungi, distinguish between the 4 main groups of fungi, and explain how lichens can affect their environment. So protists are up first. The reason we're going to talk about protists first is because they are considered to be more simple than our fungi. We always work from the most simple to the most complex when we're talking about the organization of living things. So a protist is an organism that belongs in kingdom Protista. It's a very diverse kingdom, meaning that there are lots and lots of different organisms that make up this group. Some protists are single-celled, like our bacteria were. Others are multicellular, meaning they have more than one cell that make up their bodies, or maybe they live in colonies. Most protists are producers, although there are some producers that are consumers and decomposers as well. They're usually able to control their movements, so decide where they want to go and then go to that place, but not always. So as you can see, there's lots of diversity in this group. There are some characteristics that all protists have in common. For instance, they're all eukaryotes, meaning that their cells have a nucleus. They're less complex than the other eukaryotes out there, and scientists consider them to have characteristics in common with fungi, plants, and animals. So they see connections between protists and all the other kingdoms to come of living things. Protists get their food in lots of different ways, like we said on the last slide. Most are producers, but there are some that are consumers and decomposers as well. We also see some protists that are parasites. Protists occasionally will use more than one method for getting food. So they might be a decomposer for a while, but also have the ability to be a parasite or a consumer. Plant-like protists are going to make their own food. These are producers. We talked about producers in our first book, our first unit. They have chloroplasts, just like plants, which are specialized organelles for capturing the sun's energy and using it to make sugar. Some protists are going to get food from their environment. Remember the heterotrophs we talked about when we were talking about food webs. Remember that heterotrophs get their food by eating other organisms. Many protists are going to eat small living things like bacteria, yeast, or other protists. They're not going to eat big things like animals. These protists, though, will eat in a similar way to animals. Some of them are considered decomposers. Remember that they get their energy, if they're decomposers, by breaking down dead organic matter. So they're going to eat living things that are already dead and break them down into really simple substances. They're going to do this in a similar way to the fungi that we'll talk about at the end of this lesson. And then remember that some can use more than one way to get energy. For example, a slime mold is going to be able to get energy by eating small organisms, so being a consumer, and by breaking down dead organic matter, like a decomposer. Sometimes protists are parasites as well. Remember when we talked about parasites in our first book? They're organisms that feed on another organism, a host. And they usually will do harm to that host. They're never going to benefit the host, we can say it that way. They're going to take something that host has and they're going to use it for themselves. Now the video that you see here on the slide is really interesting. It talks about a great example of a parasitic protist. And the parasitic protist in this video actually caused the Irish potato famine, which maybe you've heard about from Mr. Saunders in your history classes. Protists have to reproduce just like all other living things, and just like all the other categories we've talked about so far, protists can reproduce in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of diversity to this group. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. Sometimes they can use both methods depending on which stage they are in their life cycle. If they're going to use asexual reproduction, they're going to, that means they are just using one set of genetic information and all of those offspring are clones of the original. They're going to use one of 2 methods, either binary fission, which is where one cell divides into 2 cells, So sort of like a blob being divided into two, and now those two cells are identical, or multiple fissions, which is where one cell is going to make more than just two offspring from one parent. So picture that cell maybe dividing into 4 identical parts instead of just 2. Those are 2 ways that a protist might reproduce asexually. A protist might reproduce through sexual reproduction if there are 2 protists in the same area. This is a process called conjugation. So they're going to exchange genetic information and create a small second nucleus. Then the organism will divide and produce 4 new protists that have that same genetic material. So in sexual reproduction, we see a brand new protist and not clones of the original. It's actually an advantage in the animal, or in the kingdom of protists, kingdom Protista. There are lots of protists that can reproduce both sexually and asexually depending on their environment. Some plant-like protists, for instance, are going to switch from one to the other. Other protists are going to reproduce asexually when the environment is sort of causing them stress. So when they don't have the ability to go out and find another protist, they'll reproduce asexually on their own. And then once conditions improve, they might switch to sexual reproduction. And the reason for this is because ultimately, sexual reproduction leads to the greatest amount of diversity, and we've talked about how important diversity is in other lessons throughout the year. The reproductive cycle of our protists. These guys have some complex reproductive cycles. The protists might change forms lots of times during their life. One example of this is an organism called the PVBEX, and that's what you see here. Notice that it has a variety of forms, and because this is a parasitic protist, it lives in a variety of organs throughout the body. Up next is kingdom fungi. So fungi, or a fungus, if we're talking about just one, is an organism that cells have a nuclei, so they are considered eukaryotic cells. They have cell walls, kind of like plants, but they don't have chlorophyll, which is why they don't belong in kingdom Plantae with all the other plants. They don't have the ability to go through photosynthesis. Fungi can come in a variety of shapes and sizes and colors. It makes them fairly interesting to study. Fungi are heterotrophs, so that means that they are going to get their food from consuming something else. They're not autotrophs, they don't make their own food. However, these guys are kind of interesting heterotrophs. They can't move really, so they can't run and catch food. They can't surround their food, corner it, keep it from running away. So they have to live on whatever food is nearby to them. What they're going to do is they're going to secrete, they're going to release digestive juices into their food source, so that tree root that they're living on or the moss that they're living on. And then once that digestive juice has broken down their food source, they're going to absorb it into their body. So for this reason, fungi are considered decomposers. Sometimes they're called parasites too. It just depends on their individual situation. Most of the time, they're not parasites though. They live in mutualism with other organisms. That means that both organisms are going to benefit. For instance, this fungi that you see on the screen, called the mycorrhiza, grows in the roots of plants. So the plants are going to supply the fungus with nutrients, and then the fungus is going to help the root to absorb minerals, and it's going to protect it from other disease-causing organisms. So both the tree root and the fungi are going to benefit. All fungi are eukaryotic, like we said before, meaning that they have cells with nuclei in them. They're multicellular as well, which means that they're made up of more than one cell. Multicellular fungi are going to have these specialized cells called hyphae. And you see hyphae here in this picture, right up at the top. These are filaments, so they're thin, like string-like cells, and they have holes in the centers of them that allow the cytoplasm, which is the jelly-like substance in the middle of the cell, to flow freely between all sorts of cells. Fungi also, multicellular fungi, also have cells called mycelium, and those are going to form typically beneath the fungi. They sort of make a root-like structure, like you might see in a plant, and they form the body of the fungus. The mycelium make up the majority of the fungus, actually, and they're located, like I said, underground. Fungi can reproduce either sexually or asexually, again, depending on the situation. In asexual reproduction, the hyphae is going to break away and each part forms a new fungus, kind of like the binary fission we just talked about with our protists. Another way that asexual reproduction can happen is through the release of spores. So a spore is a tiny reproductive cell that is going to be released into the environment in some way, usually sort of like this puffball plant you see at the top of the screen, in a giant explosive release. Sexual reproduction in fungi uses specialized structures in two fungi to form a new organism with new genetic information, so no longer a clone of the parent. Fungi can be classified into 4 basic groups, and those groups are defined by their shapes and the way that they reproduce. The 4 main groups are called thread-like fungi, sac fungi, club fungi, and imperfect fungi. A thread-like fungi is sometimes more commonly known as a mold. It's a fungus that looks like wool or cotton. You may have seen it growing on bread before. Most thread-like fungi are going to live in soil. These guys are decomposers. It's the reason why if they grow on your bread starts to shrink and shrivel up a little bit, or growing on an apple, same deal. They can reproduce either asexually or sexually, depending on the situation. Sac fungi are the largest group of fungi. Yeast are considered sac fungi, and you've probably used yeast or seen yeast before. Also powdery mildews, ruffles, and whorls. They reproduce either sexually or asexually, depending on where they are in their life cycle. They're multicellular. They're actually very useful to humans. Yeast is useful in making bread and alcohol. Yeast uses sugar as its food, and alcohol and carbon dioxide are the waste products from that. Although some sac fungi, even some different types of ruffles and whorls, are harmful. Some of them can be parasites as well. The third group, club fungi, are usually known as mushrooms. There is more to this group of club fungi than just mushrooms, but they're the ones we most commonly think about when we think about this group. They reproduce sexually, and most of the mushroom, believe it or not, is actually located in those hyphae underground. The mushrooms usually grow around in a ring because they're growing around the massive hyphae in the center. So if you see a ring of mushrooms, if you were to dig a shovel right into the center of that, you would encounter a whole bunch of these root-like structures called hyphae. Gill fungi are the most familiar group of mushrooms. They have these structures sort of like called gills under their mushroom caps. So they sort of look like they have, I don't know how to describe them, sort of like the pockets in an orange or a grapefruit if you took all of the juice out underneath their cap. Not all gill fungi, not all mushrooms are edible. It's important to always remember that if you see one in the woods. Non-mushroom club fungi. So in addition to our mushrooms, bracket fungi, puffballs, smuts, and rusts are also part of this club fungi group. You see pictures of those here on the screen. Bracket fungi are going to grow outwards from wood usually. They make little shelf-like structures. Here you see them on the screen. This is an example of a smut. This is an example of rust. They're parasites that most commonly grow on plants. And our last of the 4 groups of different types of fungi are our imperfect fungi. This is like the catch-all group, the junk drawer group. It includes all of the other types of fungi that don't quite fit into the other 3 categories. These guys are going to reproduce asexually all the time. Most of them are parasites, so for instance, one of them causes athlete's foot, another one produces aflatoxin, but sometimes they're useful. Actually, the fungi that's responsible for producing the antibiotic called penicillin, the fungi is called penicillium, is an imperfect fungi. Now, in addition to fungi, we talk in this section about lichens because they are sort of this unique pairing of fungi and algae. And algae is a plant-like protist, and a fungi, of course, is a fungi. So they grow together in a symbiotic relationship where they both benefit from living together. The algae live inside protective walls of the fungus. So the algae are protected by the fungus, but the algae helps the fungus to produce its food because the algae can go through the process of photosynthesis. 2 organisms so closely linked that the scientists have actually given them a new name. These guys, like I said, are producers because the algae have the ability to go through photosynthesis. They're found in almost every type of land environment, and they can break down rocks to form new soil. They also filter water and minerals from the air. So if there's something wrong with the air supply, a loss of lichen is a good indication of pollution. So for homework today, you have your choice.